Vienna, 1847. A doctor discovers something that could save thousands of lives. The evidence is undeniable. His colleagues reject it anyway. He dies in an asylum, broken and alone. 20 years later, everyone admits he was right. This isn't a story about being ahead of your time. It's about why arguing with idiots will destroy you. And once you understand it, you'll never waste your time the same way again. Think about the last argument you had. You had facts. You had sources. You laid out your logic clearly. The other person ignored everything, pivoted to something else, then circled back to their original point as if you'd said nothing. And you kept engaging, because you thought better evidence would work. Clearer explanation would break through. Eventually, they'd have to acknowledge reality. But here's what you didn't realize. You weren't having an argument. You were trapped arguing with an idiot who wasn't even trying to understand you. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer identified this trap 200 years ago. He wrote an essay called The Art of Being Right, where he made a disturbing observation. There are two completely different types of conversation, and if you don't know which one you're in, you'll waste years of your life trying to convince people who are playing by entirely different rules. He called them dialectic and eristic. Dialectic is collaborative truth-seeking, two people genuinely trying to figure out what's actually true. You can accurately represent the other person's position. You grant valid points. When someone presents stronger evidence, you modify your stance. The goal is understanding reality, even when it means admitting you're wrong. You know you're in a dialectic conversation when evidence actually moves the discussion forward. When "I don't know" is an acceptable answer. When both people leave understanding each other better than when they started. But eristic? That's something else entirely. Eristic is the art of being right. Whether you're actually correct or not, winning matters more than truth. You're defending status, protecting identity, avoiding discomfort. The truth value of your claim becomes secondary to not losing face. Schopenhauer cataloged 38 specific stratagems he observed in eristic arguments. Attacking credibility instead of claims, demanding impossible proof standards, changing the subject when cornered, then returning as if nothing was said, extending claims to absurd extremes, then attacking the exaggeration. You've seen all of these this week. And here's the devastating part. If one person is playing dialectic while the other is playing eristic, the dialectic player loses every time. You're optimizing for truth while they're optimizing for victory. You think better evidence will help. It won't. Because when the other party isn't seeking truth, argument quality becomes completely irrelevant. You're playing chess while they're playing poker. The pieces look similar, but the win conditions are totally different. Which brings us back to that doctor in Vienna, because what happened to him reveals something disturbing. Sometimes the people you're arguing with aren't just wrong. They're incapable of being convinced, by design. His name was Ignaz Semmelweis, Vienna General Hospital. Semmelweis works in a maternity ward where women are dying at terrifying rates. One ward has an 18% maternal death rate. Nearly 1 in 5 women who come to give birth never leave. The doctors call it childbed fever and treat it like an inevitability. But Semmelweis notices something the other doctors won't acknowledge. The deadly ward is where medical students train. They come straight from the autopsy room, hands covered in the residue of corpses, and deliver babies. The other ward, staffed by midwives who never touch cadavers, has a death rate under 2%. He tests a theory, requires physicians to wash their hands in chlorine solution before examining patients. The death rate drops overnight, 18% to under 2%. His colleagues don't celebrate. They're outraged. Because accepting his discovery means confronting an unbearable truth. They've been killing their patients. Their hands, the hands they thought were healing, have been instruments of death, so they do what humans do when faced with psychologically unbearable evidence. They reject it. They mock Semmelweis, refuse to wash their hands, call him crazy, force him out of the hospital. Thousands of women continue to die. He spends 15 years trying to convince them, writing papers, presenting data, growing more desperate. Eventually he ends up in an asylum, dies at 47, possibly from infected wounds. 20 years later, Pasteur proves germ theory. Everyone realizes Semmelweis was right. Now here's the question you need to ask. Why didn't the evidence work? These weren't stupid people. They were educated physicians. The data was clear. Anyone could verify it. But they chose comfortable delusion over unbearable truth. Schopenhauer would say they weren't playing dialectic. They were playing eristic, defending territory, not seeking truth. But he went further than that. Now here's where Schopenhauer goes from philosopher to heretic. He didn't just say, people argue badly. He said some people are fundamentally incapable of rational thought, and he might have been right. Schopenhauer argued that some people are fundamentally incapable of dialectic engagement, not because they choose eristic strategies, but because they lack the mental architecture for it. He divided humanity into what he called vulgar minds and contemplative minds. The vulgar mind operates in concrete terms only: survival, status, comfort. It cannot engage with ideas abstractly, cannot separate concepts from personal identity. When you challenge their belief, they don't hear this claim might be false. They hear, you're attacking me. The contemplative mind can engage with ideas independent of personal stake, can consider hypotheticals, hold contradictory thoughts simultaneously, follow logic to uncomfortable places. Yes, Schopenhauer was an elitist, probably went too far. Modern science suggests it's a spectrum. But here's what he understood 200 years before neuroscience proved it. The limitation isn't about intelligence. It's about how beliefs get wired into the brain. Because here's what he didn't know, but what we know now. Your brain stores beliefs in the same regions that determine who you are, not in the logic centers, in the identity centers. Brain imaging studies by Jonas Kaplan at USC show that when your core beliefs are challenged, your brain activates patterns nearly identical to physical threat response. Your brain processes a challenge to your beliefs the same way it processes someone punching you in the face. This is why the Semmelweis doctors couldn't accept the evidence. It wasn't an intellectual question, it was a threat. And here's where it gets really dark. Schopenhauer proposed something he called the will, a blind, unconscious force that determines what you want before conscious thought enters. Your intellect comes second, operating like a defense lawyer for whatever the will already decided. You didn't reason your way to your political beliefs. You felt your way there first. Then you went looking for evidence to justify what you'd already decided. Modern research backs this up. Brendan Nyhan and Jason Reifler showed people false claims aligned with their political identity, then provided factual corrections. Sometimes the corrections didn't just fail. They strengthened the false belief. When beliefs are sufficiently entangled with identity, evidence can entrench them rather than correct them. And intelligence doesn't help. Dan Kahan's research shows people with higher scientific literacy are more biased on politicized topics, because they're better at finding technical reasons to reject threatening evidence. Smart people aren't better at seeking truth. They're just better at defending whatever they've decided to believe. Schopenhauer's 38 stratagems? Those aren't tools of the stupid. They're sophisticated techniques that require real cognitive skill. So when we talk about arguing with idiots, understand this. The idiot might have an IQ of 140. The distinction isn't intelligence. It's whether they're seeking truth or defending territory. And here's the really uncomfortable part. Maybe you're the idiot in someone else's story. How would you know? Now let me show you what happens when eristic argumentation goes industrial. 1950s. The science linking cigarettes to cancer becomes overwhelming. Study tracking 40,000 doctors. Smokers have 15 times higher lung cancer rates. The science is settled. But tobacco executives understood something the scientists didn't. Internal documents revealed decades later show they knew cigarettes caused cancer. A 1969 memo from a Brown and Williamson executive laid out their entire strategy in 4 words. Doubt is our product, not truth. Doubt. They recognized that accepting the science meant the end of a multi-billion-dollar industry, so they deployed heuristic strategies at scale. Didn't refute research directly. manufactured uncertainty, funded contradictory studies, hired scientists to question methodology, attacked researchers' credibility, demanded endless more research. Every Schopenhauer stratagem executed with precision, and the scientific community, they kept operating under dialectic assumptions, thought the next study would convince, that clearer data would break through. Study after study. The evidence became mountainous. 5 decades. Millions of preventable deaths. Scientists never lacked evidence. They lacked understanding that evidence was irrelevant when the other side was playing a different game. The executives weren't seeking truth. They were defending profit. And these weren't stupid people. Highly intelligent, well-educated executives. They could have engaged dialectically, they chose not to, because their game wasn't about truth. And they're still winning. Right now, in your Facebook feed, think about the arguments you're having right now. Climate change, vaccines, elections. If you're seeing these same patterns, it's not a coincidence. You're watching the tobacco playbook in real time. But here's the question. Nobody asks, how do you tell who's playing which game? In dialectic exchanges, evidence advances conversation. Both people accurately represent each other's positions. Valid points get acknowledged. Discussion builds toward understanding. In eristic exchanges, evidence gets deflected. Straw men get attacked. Corner them on one claim, they pivot to another. Address that, they return to the first as if nothing was said. It's circular. You're going in loops. That circularity is the signature. But there's another layer. Sometimes people aren't choosing eristic tactics. They're at their cognitive ceiling, complete inability to separate ideas from identity. Concrete thinking only, appeal to authority without understanding. Emotional reasoning as refutation, cannot accurately represent opposing views. When you see these consistently, you're not dealing with strategy. You're dealing with limitation. Now here's the test for yourself. Can you pass the ideological Turing test? Can you argue the opposing position so well that believers can't tell you're not one of them? If not, you don't understand it. And if you don't understand it, you're probably not engaging dialectically. Be honest with yourself. How many times have you recognized these patterns and been kept arguing anyway? You tell yourself, maybe this time will be different. It won't be. And it's costing you more than you realize. Not just time. Something worse. May 2020, Dr. Hadi Halazun finishes a long shift in the emergency room treating coronavirus patients, watching people struggle to breathe, holding phones so families can say goodbye through video calls. He goes home exhausted, opens Facebook. Someone has posted that no one's dying from COVID, that hospitals are empty and doctors are lying for money. Halazun thinks, I can fix this. I'm a doctor. I was just there. I'll explain. He comments, describes his day, the patients he treated. The responses come fast. Users examine his profile, find photos of him at concerts, point to these as proof. He's not a real doctor. He must be an actor. Part of the hoax. I told them, I am a real doctor, Halazun later said in an NBC News interview. He described dealing with conspiracy theorists as the second most painful thing I've had to deal with, other than separation of families from their loved ones. Second most painful. After watching patients die alone. This is happening everywhere. Dr. Rajiv Fernando hosts radio shows to share accurate information. 1 out of every 2 callers references 5G towers or lab conspiracies. By 2021, roughly half of healthcare epidemiologists are experiencing burnout, not just from treating patients, from this. Here's what nobody's tracking, whether it's working. Later analysis shows that despite extensive debunking throughout 2020 to 2021, many COVID false beliefs became more widespread, not less. The people who accepted corrections were already predisposed too. The people spreading misinformation learned, refined their talking points, adapted. The correctors were training their opponents. And what did they lose? The papers they didn't write, the research they didn't publish, the work that would have lasted. 360 hours of arguing online could have been 3 published papers, trained students, educational resources, something permanent instead of something exhausting. But what about people watching? If doctors stay silent, won't they think the misinformation stands? Here's what observers actually see. When someone posts a false claim and a doctor responds, then back and forth for dozens of exchanges, it looks like legitimate debate, like both sides have a point. But when a doctor posts one clear statement and doesn't engage with conspiracies below it, that looks like someone who doesn't need to defend the truth. That carries authority. This is the real cost. Not just time spent, but the transformation it causes. After enough of this, you assume bad faith everywhere. Genuine questions look like attacks. Your capacity for nuanced thinking erodes, all while the misinformation continues to spread, but there's a different path, and it's been hiding in history all along. While his contemporaries burned years in public feuds, Schopenhauer withdrew, wrote in isolation, published his work, let it stand on merit, didn't defend it for decades. During his lifetime, the book sold poorly. Critics dismissed it. The establishment ignored him. Those critics are now forgotten. His work remains influential 2 centuries later. This pattern repeats. Max Planck observed, "A new scientific truth doesn't triumph by convincing opponents. It triumphs because opponents eventually die, and a new generation grows up taking it for granted." Darwin didn't convince critics through argumentation, built overwhelming evidence that became impossible to ignore, mostly among younger scientists without career investment in old paradigms. The older generation largely died unconvinced. Semmelweis's handwashing wasn't adopted because he found the right argument. It was adopted by a new generation after Pasteur made germ theory undeniable. You could argue there's a moral obligation to argue publicly when silence might seem like agreement, true to a point. But even then, the revolutionaries understood. A well-constructed monument to truth does more than 1,000 heated exchanges. The people who changed the world focused on building irrefutable work rather than winning arguments. They invested in evidence accumulation, not persuasion. Wrote for future readers, not contemporary critics. They recognized when they were being pulled into eristic battles and chose not to engage. Not because they couldn't win, because winning was the wrong goal. But this leaves a question. If most people are wired to defend territory instead of seek truth, what does that mean for humanity? Schopenhauer had an answer, and it's darker than you think. Schopenhauer's analysis reveals something uncomfortable about human cognition. Most people, most of the time, are not primarily motivated by discovering truth. They're motivated by maintaining consistency with existing beliefs, preserving social status, avoiding cognitive discomfort, protecting group belonging, and defending their sense of self. This isn't a moral indictment. It's an observation about how human psychology actually functions. For most of human history, this made evolutionary sense. Our ancestors' survival depended on quick pattern recognition, tribal cohesion, and confident action, not careful truth-seeking. Believing the rustling in the grass was a predator when it was just wind had minimal cost. Believing it was wind when it was a predator meant death. We inherited brains optimized for survival, not truth-seeking. This is why confirmation bias exists. Why we're better at recognizing logical fallacies in arguments we disagree with than in arguments we support. Why we can hold contradictory beliefs without noticing. Our reasoning capacity evolved not to discover truth, but to win arguments and maintain coalitions. Jonathan Haidt's research demonstrates this. We make moral judgments intuitively and emotionally, then use reason to justify them afterward. The reasoning is post hoc rationalization, not the actual cause of the belief. And intelligence makes this worse, not better. Smarter people are better at motivated reasoning. They can construct more sophisticated justifications for whatever they've decided to believe. The distinction isn't about IQ or education. It's about whether someone is in truth-seeking mode or territory defense mode. And most of the time, most people are defending territory because that's what their brain architecture demands. What does this mean for how you allocate your time and energy? Schopenhauer's framework suggests that direct persuasion is rarely the path to intellectual change, that evidence accumulation matters more than rhetorical victory. That time operates as the crucial variable, not argument quality. The truth tends to win eventually, but it wins through generations, not debates. Let me bring this full circle. Ignaz Semmelweis had everything rationality requires: verifiable evidence, repeatable results, clear causation, truth on his side. He failed anyway, not because he was wrong, not because his arguments were weak, but because his colleagues weren't playing the truth-seeking game. They were defending against unbearable reality. No amount of evidence could have convinced them, because conviction was never the goal. This is what Schopenhauer's analysis reveals. Sometimes recognizing what kind of conversation you're in matters more than winning the argument. Time is the only unrecoverable resource. How you allocate it determines everything. You can spend years trying to convince the unconvincible, dying frustrated while being proven right posthumously, or you can spend them building irrefutable work, letting evidence accumulate, writing for the future instead of arguing with the present. The truth will win eventually. It almost always does. The question is whether you'll be there to see it, and whether you'll have spent your irreplaceable time in ways that actually matter. Stop arguing with idiots. Start building monuments. Schopenhauer's analysis isn't a strategy for winning arguments. It's a framework for understanding when arguments are the wrong tool, when evidence accumulation matters more than rhetorical combat, when building something undeniable serves truth better than defending it in debate. You probably thought of someone while watching this, maybe more than one person. Here's the thing. Don't share this to prove a point to them. That would be ironic, and Schopenhauer would not approve. Share it if you think they're genuinely curious. Share it if they've already shown they can change their mind. Share it if you needed to hear this and you think they might too, because the goal was never to win. It was to stop losing. Sharing this isn't winning either. It's just passing the idea forward. The next generation will figure it out. They always do. The question is what you'll build for them to find.